Picture this. You walk into class for day one at HPP. You see everyone dangling from mobility bands like Cirque du Soleil performers. Do you question coach before class even begins? Or do you just grab a band and start yanking on it until your shoulder dislocates? On today's episode, I'm going to teach you how to use mobility bands and get your joints loose before a workout. This is Coach's Corner. Alright, so what we're talking about today is essentially joint mobilizations using the mobility bands. Joint mobilizations are a technique we use on the physical therapy side of things, primarily with the clinician's hands, providing force. The joint mobilizations, I define it as passive forces applied to the joint capsule to improve what we call accessory movements. So the joint capsule essentially is you have two long bones and the ligaments and connective tissue connecting them, typically at the axis of movement. So think about like a knee joint, hip joint, ankle joint, the connective tissues that make up that joint is what we consider the capsule. And then accessory movements. Accessory movements, I would define it as physiologic mechanics of a joint that cannot be actively reproduced by themselves. So, for example, we'll get into the mechanics in a second with the whole roll and slide mechanism, concave, convex rules, but essentially you can't make the ball and socket joint in your hip. You can't make that move without, like using the muscles to flex up your hip. So you can't do a posterior glide of the hip without using your muscles to actively provide hip flexion. That's an example. The roll and slide theory, which is drawn on this whiteboard, is essentially kind of depends on what bone is moving on the stationary bone, and that would depend on if your movement is what we call open versus closed chain. So open chain movement would be my elbow joint, for example. My arm is freely moving in space on a fixed humerus. My forearm is moving on the humerus. Closed chain movement would be something like, we can take the elbow joint again for example, a push-up. A push-up, your hand and forearm are now fixed on a floor or a stationary surface, and your humerus is now moving freely on that fixed forearm. That would be a closed chain movement, and the joint mechanics are going to be different. Now this bone is moving on this bone, or vice versa if it's an open chain movement. So that's going to basically determine the arthrokinematics, or the joint movements or mechanics that's going on. So you can see right here on picture number one that you have the ball on top and the socket on the bottom. So in order for this motion to occur, the ball would be moving on the concave socket. We would have to have this ball roll to the right but slide to the left in order to maintain its congruency in the joint. So the roll and the slide happens in opposite directions. All right, so you can see on the bottom you have a concave socket on a convex ball. In order for this joint to bend, the roll and the slide have to occur in the same direction. And that's going to make a difference when we're doing our band mobilizations in choosing the correct bone to place the band over. So the bone that we'll be placing the band on will be the bone that's moving. And the accessory movement that we'll be providing out of the roll and the slide is primarily the slide. You can also call them glides. So I'm going to be showing you some different examples of them now for some of the peripheral joints that are commonly used in strength and conditioning programs. So I hope you guys enjoy, and let me know in the comments what you think of band mobilizations. All right, so for all of these mobilizations, I recommend taking your shoes off. We're going to be doing some for the hips and the ankles that you're going to need to get. Sometimes the band is going to be on the top of the foot. So I would just take your shoes off before getting into some of these. There's different concepts for joint mobilizations in terms of whether they are sustained holds or if you get to the end range and you oscillate. I'm not really going to get into detail about that right now. I will mention when I'm doing some of these if you are supposed to oscillate at the end range or not, but I'm not really going to talk about the why and how we apply them on the physical therapy side. So the very first one that I want to show you guys is the hip distraction mobilization. Within some of the joint mobilizations, you can provide, instead of just gliding the joint, you can provide a traction or a distraction where you take the capsule and you pull on one end and it just kind of stretches the entire capsule. So these distractions that I'm going to show you for each joint, that's kind of the goal. So for the hip, you're going to make a figure eight kind of underneath your heel and then over the top of the foot, and then you're going to wiggle your way out away from the anchor,
and you're just going to let the band pull on you. You can put the band at different heights. So if I had the band a little bit higher, my leg would be elevated and my leg would be into a little bit of hip flexion. I don't know if you guys can see that. That's better. So you can see my leg is kind of suspended right now. The weight of my leg is being pulled by the tension in the band. And so I would hold this one for a couple of minutes. If you can't tolerate it that long, just do 4 rounds of 30 seconds. So this next one is going to be a posterior glide for the hip. And this one works really well in a standing position. So you can see the band is pulling back on my hip joint. I'm standing primarily on my right leg so that my left leg is unweighted. You don't want the tension in your muscles to be fighting the band. So for this one, you kind of want to get into a little bit of hip flexion because that's what that posterior glide is going to help assist with. And right now I'm just kind of hanging on the tension in the band. And just, again, you can oscillate a little bit at end range with this one if you want, since it's a glide. I would do 4 rounds, 30-second holds. The next one that we can do, this is what we call a lateral glide. So you can see the band is now coming perpendicular to my femur. The band is anchored up high in the hip joint, and I'm kind of getting into this squat position here with my leg. You can see my hip is maximally flexed. One option when you're doing these mobilizations is to mobilize at the position of restriction, which is a good idea if you're trying to enhance movement, for example, a squat or a lunge pattern to loosen up the hip joint. So this one you can kind of oscillate at end range 4 times for 30 seconds. You can also do this one in the pigeon position. So this would be another alternative, a posterior glide in the pigeon position with oscillations. The last one for the hip is going to be this anterior glide. So now I'm facing where the band is anchored, and the band is now pulling my hip forward. This is going to help with hip extension. And so for this one, you really don't want to push too much into the stretch. So I'm just kind of hanging comfortably, letting the band pull on my hip joint. And you can oscillate a little bit if you want, 4 times, 30 seconds. All right, so for the knee joint, we can also do a long axis distraction of the tibiofemoral joint. You're going to kind of figure eight your foot again. And this time, when you're going out, you're going to kind of hook underneath the distal end of your femur. And so now, as I rock back, instead of laying all the way back and letting the weight go through my hip joint, now I'm kind of anchoring down this femur and letting the traction go through the knee joint. Try not to have your foot actively fighting the band, so just kind of let it hang. This one can be a sustained hold for about 2 minutes. The next ones I want to show you guys are going to be patellar mobilizations. Patellar mobilizations are some of the easiest mobilizations that you learn. We learned them kind of day one in physical therapy school. The best way to mobilize a patella, or the easiest way to visualize it, is with the knee fully extended. You can see the patella moves medial, it moves lateral, it moves superior, it moves inferior. You just take your hands and you kind of cup the borders of the patella, and then you can kind of feel which direction is tight or needs work. Typically, if you want to improve your flexion, so your knee bending for your squat, you want to work on the inferior glide. So I usually just take the web space of my hand and then push down on the kneecap 4 times for 30 seconds. You want to push to that restriction. And that's pretty much it for patellar mobilizations. Next one we can do is an anterior glide of the tibia. If we're tight in this direction, again, I'm not trying to diagnose you guys today. I'm just merely showing you guys options. So if you need this one, this is a good way to get the tibia going forward on the femur. This will help with knee extension. You can kind of work in different ranges. It's a little bit harder to do this one in the position of restriction, so if you're having trouble getting your knee fully locked out, it's kind of difficult to mobilize in that position, so that's why I'm doing it a little bit of flexion right now. Same thing for posterior glide. So for posterior glide here, you're working on moving the tibia back on the femur. This one, you might have to kind of hold down a little bit so that the band doesn't move up, because as the knee joint bends and the tibia starts to get angled, that axis is going to shift a little bit lower. Same thing, 4 rounds, 30 seconds, oscillated end range if you need to. Those two really aren't commonly used because the knee joint just typically doesn't need to be worked in that fashion unless you had a knee surgery. A long axis distraction. You can do this one. A lot of times you'll see people hanging from like a squat rack with the band anchored at the top of the squat rack, or somewhere anchored high on top of a cable column or something, and then they're standing or kneeling. You can do it really in any position. I'm sitting here in a quadruped position. My arm is in shoulder flexion right now. And what's important is I like to rotate the thumb up. It's going to externally rotate the shoulder joint and kind of give some more freedom for that mobilization. Again, with this one, you don't want to actively fight it. Just kind of relax and let the band pull you. Should feel like a nice gentle stretch through the shoulder joint. You can hold that for 2 minutes if you like. And then the next one, you can do a lateral glide or a lateral distraction. So you're going to anchor this one high up in the armpit, and you're just going to kind of bring your arm across your body, letting the band kind of pull you into a posterior lateral direction. That one's going to be 4 rounds for 30 seconds. And the next one, this is going to be a posterior glide, working on for shoulder flexion. Typically the lats tend to be the limiting factor with shoulder flexion in people that have healthy shoulders, but if your shoulder's tight, if you had surgery, you can kind of put this band here. You want it kind of anchored, again, high up in the armpit, kind of below the deltoid where it ties in. And then you're just going to kind of put the arm a little bit overhead, and you're going to kind of rock into that band so that it's pulling down on your humerus. And that one you're going to oscillate at end range, 4 rounds for 30 seconds. All right, so for the ankle, we're going to use, We're going to use this thinner band just because I feel like it kind of gets the congruency of the ankle joint a little bit better. If you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, just say the word congruency a bunch of times. All right, so you can see with my socks that the band is going to sit below the ankle joint. So here's the malleolus, here's the top of the talus bone. So you really want this band to be below the joint line for this one. For our concave convex rules, the concave talar dome, so the tibia and fibula come down, that's going to be your concave joint. We don't want to push that backwards. We're trying to move forward because that's not how the rules work. So we're going to put it on the ball or the dome of the talus, and then we're going to go into dorsiflexion. Try to keep your heel down. You're defeating the purpose of the stretch if your heel comes up. So I typically just take my hand and lock down my calcaneus, and then I just work in the position of restriction and mobilize. 4 rounds for 30 seconds. The ankle joint is a little bit harder to do the distraction on, mainly because you have to keep your toes up in order to keep the band from rebounding from the figure 8. But if you can kind of manage it, you can now hold, like we talked about the knee joint holding up here, you can hold the tibia and just pull and try to relax your foot, and that'll give you kind of a distraction through the ankle joint. It's not very good, but you get the idea. We're gonna get a medium-sized band. I'm now gonna put it slightly below the elbow joints. I'm gonna walk back till I have tension, and then I'm going to basically curl my hand to my shoulder. So I'm going into an elbow flexion position, and I'm kind of scooping this ulnar radius, and that's going to provide kind of a scoop or fulcrum distraction of the joint. Again, elbow flexion is not really something that people are limited in, but if you are, you can try that one. And then for elbow extension, this one, you want to go slightly above the elbow joint. And then what I usually have my patients do is you want the joint to be, the forearm to be angled a little bit forward, because if you put this hand way out in front and you try to lean back, you're going to be limited by the flexibility of your soft tissue of your wrist flexors. So in order to get around that, just put the hand a little bit closer to you, and then you're going to use your body weight to kind of lean into it. This one is going to feel pretty uncomfortable. Kind of feels like someone's trying to break my elbow right now. So if you're limited with your elbow extension, like with your lockout position, this might be a good one to try. But if you're not limited with that, you probably don't need to do these two. Last two are going to be for the wrist. So for this wrist one, I put it on top of my wrist, and then I kind of threaded it through my fingers. That way I don't have to grip it. So I'm just kind of loosely holding it, and then I'm wiggling my body weight backwards. And again, I'm not fighting it with my forearm muscles. I'm just kind of letting the band pull. If you want a little bit more anchor from the proximal joint, you can hold your forearm down, and that way you can let the band just kind of work on your wrist. And then the last one is going to be an anterior glide. We call this one a palmar glide because it's going in the palmar towards the palm, direction of the palm. But you're going to put it basically on top of the back of your hand, and then you're going to work into wrist extension and work in that position of restriction. You can see it a little bit there. I'm kind of leaning over it, and this band is pulling me, similar to the ankle joint, but instead of dorsiflexion, we're working on wrist extension. 4 times for 30 seconds, oscillating at the end range. And that's pretty much all for the peripheral joints. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.